Hey, what's up guys, it's Bakes and thank you for joining me with today's list, my top 10 favourite sophomore albums. In the past on my channel before, I've already done my top 10 debut albums, so now it's time to get into the follow-ups. What are my 10 favourite second full-length albums by a band or artist? Not all the time, but majority of the time I find the follow-up albums to be stronger than the debuts, just because, the nerves of making a full-length album for the first time are all out. They've started to get better as a collective and, hone their craft, so normally the follow-up albums are a little bit stronger, but nevertheless, I'm sure this list is pretty self-explanatory. Let's get into it. My 10 favourite sophomore albums, starting off at my number 10. Now, am I jumping the gun with my number 10? Possibly, especially considering this album's only been out for a month, but here I have Olivia Rodrigo's album Guts. I genuinely feel like this was such a strong improvement from her first album Sour, and not to say that Sour was a bad album, I actually still think it's pretty solid, but looking back it probably doesn't hold up as much as it did from early on. I just feel like Sour had too many ballads on it, and as I said in my intro, she's still such a young musician and she's still sort of honing her craft and figuring out how to put together a full-length album to the best of her abilities, but as I said, I feel like Guts was such a good step in the right direction and such a solid sophomore. I feel like there's just more diversity on this album. The track list from start to finish I feel like is a better effort. Obviously, I didn't want to put it higher on this list because, as I said, it's only been out for a month, so I think the number 10 spot is fine for now, but I genuinely do feel like this was a solid sophomore, so coming in at my number 10 is Guts by Olivia Rodrigo. Coming in at my number 9 spot is the album Earth is a Black Hole by the band Teenage Wrist. Now, first of all, if you've never heard of Teenage Wrist, do yourself a favour. Just a really solid two-piece that sort of do a twist on modern grunge, mix that with emo rock and some pop punk as well, and this album is just really solid and kind of even slept on for myself. I've always liked this album, obviously, but when you listen to it from start to finish, it just runs so smoothly and it's just such a solid effort. From the opening instrumental track Squeeze all the way to the closing track Stellar, it's just constant consistency. This album is really solid. Now, their first album I believe was called Chrome Neon Jesus. I was never a huge fan of that album, but I still kind of need to listen to it more. This was my introduction to the band, and I feel like it is genuinely a safe album to start with because, as I said, the consistency from the first track to the closing is all there, and as I said, just so many different genres that they kind of lean into. As I said, like a twist on modern grunge, emo rock. If that's the type of music that you're into, this is definitely an album to check out. So coming in at my number 9 is Earth is a Black Hole by the band Teenage Wrist. Coming in at my number 8 is the album Nulla Vita by the band Grayscale. Again, just such a solid sophomore album. I actually had Grayscale's first album featured on my top 10 debut albums list. That album was called Adornment, and that album itself is crazy good, but I find this sophomore to just be, again, a step above. Adornment is more traditional pop punk sounding, and don't get me wrong, this album still features plenty of pop punk songs, songs like Just Right, Painkiller Weather, just to name a few, but then it also leans into more just traditional pop, dance kind of grooviness tracks as well, songs like Baby Blue, Twilight, Desert Queen, In My Arms. I just feel like this track list from start to finish is again just more consistent, gives more variety, and I just find it to be such a strong sophomore album. So coming in at my number 8 is Nulla Vita by the band Grayscale. Coming in at my number 7 is the album From Under the Cork Tree by Fall Out Boy. Now, I've said this so many times on my channel before, but Fall Out Boy is one of, if not my favourite band of all time. And for their whole discography, this could be one of my most slept on Fall Out Boy albums, but still it's solid enough I needed to feature it on this sophomore album list. It's just such a strong album. It's kind of the album that first put the light on the band. Their first album, Take This to Your Grave, was a bit more underground. But songs like Sugar We're Going Down and Dance Dance, hit the mainstream and, started to put the band in a more center stage sort of light. But even the back catalogue of this album is so fucking strong. So maybe if you haven't listened to old Fall Out Boy in a while, go back and check out their sophomore album, From Under the Cork Tree, because it's really solid, and obviously I have it at my number 7. So coming in at my number 7 is From Under the Cork Tree by the band Fall Out Boy. Coming in at my number 6 is the band As It Is and their sophomore album, OK. I find this album to be insanely underrated, and honestly, As It Is as a band, I feel like just get too much hate. I feel like it could be they sort of got pushed into this cringe category because of their lead singer, Patty Walters, who started on YouTube, which I don't see a problem with. You got to start somewhere, so it's never been an issue with me. But nevertheless, I'm getting off topic. A super underrated sophomore album. Their first album, Never Happy Ever After, was, traditional straight up pop punk. This one again is definitely pop punk, but it's actually very dark in tone, especially like the lyrics. This album's sort of like got this melancholy feel to it. So if you're into like emo music as well, this will be right up your alley, and I definitely recommend giving it a listen. I'm not too sure what my favourite overall As It Is album is. It's either this one or their third album, The Great Depression. But as I said, this one's definitely an underrated listen, so I would recommend it. Coming in at my number 6 is the album OK by the band As It Is. My number 5 is actually an album I honestly forget is a sophomore, but here I have Chemical Miracle by the band Trophy Eyes. The reason why I forget that it's a sophomore is I don't own their first album, Mend and Move On, and I've never really had an interest in picking up that album either. Kind of like what I said in my intro, I feel like that album was very much them sort of honing their craft and trying to figure out what sound they want to go with, and it never really clicked with me, but this album is really fucking solid. From the first time I listened to it, it was my first taste of Trophy Eyes as a band. It just intrigued me. The band is such a unique sounding band, but they're so solid as well. John with his vocals, it's very raspy and rough around the edges, but it just works and adds to the flavour, which is Trophy Eyes. The instrumentals overall solid. The track list in this one is just chef's kiss from start to finish. The only songs that I can really be like, I don't really care for is Chemical and Miracle, which is just two little sort of interludes thrown in there. But overall, such a solid album from start to finish. So coming in at my number 5 is Chemical Miracle by the band Trophy Eyes. Coming in at my number 4 is actually an album I've recently picked up, but one that I've listened to from the day it dropped. Here I have No Good Left to Give by the band Movements. The one thing that has always come to mind when thinking about this album is how well it flows from start to finish. I feel like there is just no major decline when you're listening to the album from front to back. It's full of just consistently good songs. I definitely feel like this album flows the best out of the 3 full-length albums that Movements have done. What I will say is, out of the 3 albums, the other 2 have the higher highs, with how good their songs are. But as I said, they don't have the consistency that this one has. I feel like this album is like effortlessly easy to listen to. It just flows so well. If you've never listened to Movements again, I would just recommend this album in a heartbeat. It's like emo rock mixed with a little bit of grunge. It is just so solid. As I said, from the opening track, In My Blood, to my favourite song on the album, The Closer, Love Took the Last of It. It's just consistently good, so I needed to feature this in my list of sophomores. Here I have No Good Left to Give by the band Movements. Coming in at my number 3 is the album Identity Crisis by Waster. Now, Waster is a band I'll never get tired of talking about. I still stand by it. Probably the most underrated pop-punk band making music at this time. They just keep flying under the radar, and I don't know how they do it, but nevertheless, this album is insanely good. It's my favourite album of the 3 full-length albums that they've done so far. It's just consistently good from start to finish. Each song has its own personality and its own flavour, but mix it together, it just spits out a really fucking solid album. Waster is also a band that I did feature in my top 10 debut albums as well. Their first album, Red, Green or In Between, really solid also. I just feel like this album's a little bit more polished, and again, their songs are given a bit more personality. If you want to check out Waster, I highly recommend it. As I said, if you're a fan of pop-punk music, they're just going to keep flying under the radar, so I need to put them out there. Check out Waster. They sound very similar to one of, again, if not my favourite band of all time, Neck Deep. And Neck Deep are a more popular and well-known band. So if they're up your alley, check out Waster, because if you like Neck Deep, you're going to like Waster. So coming in at my number 3, getting back to the topic of it, Identity Crisis by the band Waster. Spoiler alert, but we're going to definitely be having a run home of pop-punk albums here, but coming in at my number 2 is Armageddon by the band Between You and Me. Maybe not as underrated as Waster, but still definitely an underrated band and an underrated album. This album just didn't get spoken about enough for the year it came out, 2021, and still should be talked about to this day, but Armageddon is so fucking solid. And what I highlight this album as being the most is such a big improvement from their first. I actually had this as my number 1 for a list I did really early on in my channel, top 10 improvements between albums. Their first album, Everything Is Temporary, isn't bad by any means. I just find it to be sort of fine, you know, good songs, some weak songs, it's just okay. But this album is insanely good. Again, all of the songs are given a bit more personality, their own distinct sort of feel, but the album again just has this consistency and flow to it that has it to be overall a really solid effort. So coming in as my number 2 for sophomore albums, I have Armageddon by the band Between You and Me. My number 1 is probably no surprise to anybody unless you forgot that it's a sophomore album, but what I mean by that is I always speak about this album on my channel. It's one of, if not my favourite album of all time, but coming in at number 1 is Life's Not Out to Get You by Neck Deep. I could speak about this album for hours, and I want to, but I'll try and keep it short and sharp. I remember coming across this album. It was my first taste of the band Neck Deep, and it was everything that I wanted and didn't know that I wanted in an album at the same time. It just hit a sweet spot, and again, I had their first album featured in my favourite debut albums list as well, Wishful Thinking. But again, this album just took it to another level, and Wishful Thinking, I was happy with that album, but again, just crazy good consistency with this album. I feel like every single song here at one time has been my favourite song on the album, and that's just insane to think about. So again, I'm going to try and just keep this short and sharp, else I'm going to fucking talk your ears off. Coming in at my number 1 is Life's Not Out to Get You by the band Neck Deep. So thank you guys for joining me for this list of my top 10 favourite sophomore albums. Now I did want to quickly say this because I don't say it enough in my top 10 videos, even though I'm sure you guys would just understand it's a given. But these lists are just my personal 10 favourites, you know, I'm not telling you that these are the definitive top 10 best sophomore albums out there. There are so many great, you know, I'm going to keep this video as an example, sophomore albums out there. But sometimes I like featuring albums that maybe not a lot of people know of because, you know, they're personal favourites to me and I want to put them on yours guys' radars. So sometimes I understand, you know, I'm missing some great, again, using this video as an example, sophomore albums. But again, it's personal to me and I like putting some albums that I feel like fly under radars on, you know, yours guys' lookout. So that's what I like doing here. But let me know some of your favourite sophomore albums in the comments below. Feel free to go for it. You know, if there are any albums that you want to talk about that I did feature in this list, again, hit me up in the comments. I don't give a fuck. Feel free to say whatever you want. But again, it's all just sort of personal to me and whatever. But thank you for joining me for this list, guys. And I'll see you for another video soon. Peace.